This is the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive ScottishVisits.co.uk.
Hello, this is John Harbour from Exclusive Scottish Visits, and welcome to my September Letter from Scotland, the Unique Scotland podcast that brings you the latest news from the United Kingdom with a Scottish slant. It gives you an insight into what makes this tiny country tick. It takes newsprint, TV and radio commentary and turns it into a bite-sized viewpoint from a local perspective with a slightly humorous edge. Are tighter restrictions on personal freedom about to get a lot worse during an inevitable second wave of coronavirus? Why is the previous leader of the Scottish National Party having to go to court to demand the release of papers in the public inquiry into his botched sex scandal? And why would it appear that he may be the one who is also blocking other papers in the same inquiry from coming to light? And why would salmon fish farmers invest millions to scoop up salmon poo? And did Elise manage to raise the $1 million required to buy Inchconnecan Island on Loch Lomond to save it from private development? Well, it's all here, and I'll be bringing you the latest in the turbulent world of COVID, Scottish politics, an update on the royal family's holiday in Scotland, and a story of triumph over adversity. So sit back and enjoy your Letter from Scotland with John Harbour of Exclusive Scottish Visits. Remember, you heard it here first. Sadly, COVID still dominates the headlines, and as I said in my last letter from Scotland, the virus was kept at bay due to a comprehensive lockdown. But when restrictions were lifted, then it would not take a rocket science to predict that COVID would spread once more. And so it is. Scotland, and the rest of the UK of course, is heading for a second wave of COVID infections. It is believed that up to 4.5 million vulnerable people are most at risk from the illness. And they are the elderly and those with underlying health issues, and also being overweight seems to cause greater health risks. And this group will be asked to stay at home or given tailored advice on protecting themselves. It would also appear that letters containing specific advice will be sent to these vulnerable individuals in those categories. And this shielding programme, as it's called, is due to operate in local areas where severe levels of infection are being experienced. But the government does retain the right to introduce a blanket ban once more if the infection takes hold again. In Scotland, the Greater Glasgow area and parts of Dundee are still under lockdown once more, so it will be interesting to see in the coming weeks and months if we return to a total ban on meeting others and travel. Before you travel to UK and Scotland, please do check the Foreign and Commonwealth Office website for entry restrictions. I mean, there's no point in visiting if you're going to be quarantined for 2 weeks. And what about a vaccine? Well, you may have heard about the Oxford University trials that appear to be going quite well. And Sir John Bell of Oxford, and one of the world's top immunologists, said that the majority of vaccines take around 8 years to develop, and in his words, we've been at this for just 8 months. However, Letter from Scotland can disclose that there is much to be optimistic about Oxford's candidate and its progress to Phase 3, with trials having been conducted on large numbers of patients in the UK, the USA, South Africa and Brazil. And with that, there is a hope that a working vaccine could be ready by the end of the year. The UK government is so confident of success that 30 million doses have already been ordered. Now, with 60 million of a UK population, I just have to find a clinic with the vaccine and be in the first half of the queue. Of course, it's not all plain sailing, and the trial was paused for a while during the week, and that was due to an unexplained illness in one of the volunteers. But this was a normal precaution, and the trial has since resumed. Other trials are going on all over the world, and China seems to be at stage 3 as well. Now, as I mentioned in my last letter from Scotland, the Russians have already approved a vaccine, and President Vladimir Putin proudly announced that it had passed all the needed checks. Indeed, he declared that it had been trialled on his daughter. Now, I have to admit that a thought crossed my mind at the time of his announcement that it might have been a bit more powerful, the message, if Mr. Putin had declared that the vaccine had been trialled on himself. I'm just saying, Mr. Putin. Sir John Bell of Oxford, when asked about the Russian vaccine, was quoted as saying, "These countries have their own drug regulations. We have rules, and people who oversee those rules are independent of political influence. We do that for a reason." And he went on to say, "Just a piece of advice. I would not have the Russian vaccine." Well, he also went on to say that the Oxford trial is probably about 3 to 4 months ahead of anybody else with a practical vaccine, but it won't be here in time to alleviate the second wave of the virus spreading, so brace yourself, folks. And even as I put this newsletter together, more restrictions are being brought in across the UK to curb the spread of the virus, including limiting the number of people that can meet, and that's limited to 6 and only from 2 households. I'll update you on the progress in the next letter from Scotland in October. Turning to Scottish politics, well, it looks as if the COVID truce on Scottish independence has been broken. In the midst of the worst pandemic the world has ever seen, Nicola Sturgeon is planning legislation about a second referendum on independence. Even though lives are being lost, this seems to be the SNP's Scottish Government priority. So, Alex Cole-Hamilton, a Liberal Democrat politician, stated recently, and he became quite animated on the subject and is quoted as saying, "I lost my rag in Parliament last week. Something inside of me snapped and I let fly at the nationalist government benches with everything I had. The trigger for my tirade can be found in the contents of the First Minister's programme for government. What specifically got my goat was the inclusion within it of a piece of legislation that will define the timescales and the question used on the ballot of a second independence referendum." Now, you may remember that last week I told you that Scotland had already had an independence referendum in 2014. Actually, that was the second one. They had one a few years before. And all parties agreed that the result would be respected for a generation. Well, the SNP never got over the fact that a large majority rejected breaking away from the United Kingdom, so Alex Cole took great offence of the nationalists continuously harping on this subject. And he goes on to say, "I know it's an SNP government and independence is their main thing, so I shouldn't have been surprised. But 6 months ago, at the start of the pandemic, we were told that everything had changed. Legislation and areas of policy crying out for attention were halted and the decks were cleared for our pandemic response. The expansion of publicly funded childcare, hospital waiting time targets, the threadbare condition of our police estate, action on climate change and reform of the Gender Recognition Act were all piled on the bonfire of COVID. So all-consuming was the pandemic that it was put to us that every arm of government and every minute of parliamentary time would be taken up with the enactment of public health measures and the design and administration of lockdown. We didn't like it, but went along with it. We were in the teeth of an international emergency, and when that happens, the role of the opposition changes. The emergency continues, but we've all learned to live around it, and much of lockdown has been lifted. As such, there was some hope we could revive some of these abandoned policies in this, our final session of Parliament before the election. Instead, Nicola Sturgeon decided to use precious parliamentary time to satisfy her fan base with another divisive skirmish around the Constitution. That for me, that's Mr. Cole that is unforgivable. We aren't just talking about an afternoon of rhetorical knockabout between those who support independence and those who oppose it. Actual legislation takes time and effort. Otto von Bismarck once said that laws are like sausages, it's better not to see them being made. And that statement is as true in the 21st century Holyrood as it was in the 19th century Reichstag. And he does have a point, because when a new bill is announced, a standard and laborious government administrative process swings into action, with political staff and civil servants producing the huge amount of paper that goes to making up a new bill. And this just takes a huge amount of time and money. I think why Mr Cole is getting so agitated is that the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, who heads up the SNP government, insisted that the work on independence had stopped to ensure that people and businesses that need help were the first priority. Well, Mr Cole goes on to say, "This is a period in Scottish history when there are children waiting over 2 years for first-line mental health treatment, when Scotland has the worst drug deaths in the whole of the developed world, when our educational attainment gap is widening all the time, and when the extension of state-funded childcare can mean the difference between families in poverty and families making a living." Mr Cole goes on to say that these are all problems of the SNP's creation and their negligence. A final term programme for government which addresses these things would command cross-party support. Yet, because the SNP have dallied for so long, the government know these things will be impossible to fix before the election, and as such they've used the emergency as a means of deferring action. That the First Minister should still find time for a constitutional sideshow that will consume months of parliamentary time should make all of us angry. Well, interesting perspective from Mr Alex Cole-Hamilton, who is the Scottish Liberal Democrat MSP for Edinburgh Western. So, fun and games in the Scottish Devolved Assembly. In the meantime, the Labour Party is tearing itself apart as there are calls for the Labour Party leader to stand down because of the lamentably weak leadership that he has shown, in the party's opinion, and there are at least 12 of his own party calling for him to resign. It will be interesting in the coming months to see if he jumps or is pushed. And this Unique Scotland letter from Scotland will keep you informed. The Conservative Party are gaining strength since their new leader came to power. Mr Douglas Ross, who speaks pretty well and makes a powerful case for putting aside the independence constitutional arguments and calling for the SNP to work with the other parties to help the government to get on with the day job. Well, I'll let you know how all this develops next month. In last month's letter from Scotland, I reported on the inquiry into the last SNP leader, Mr Alex Salmond, who was accused, then acquitted, of serious sexual assault charges. This inquiry continues, but as interesting as it is, and very much in the public interest to know what's going on, BBC One Scotland TV channel has chosen not to report on it. Now you have to ask yourself, is any pressure from any group in Scotland trying to keep this inquiry out of the public eye? Well, there's certainly no evidence that this is the case, but for such a high-profile inquiry, it seems odd that the Scottish BBC is being quiet. So, a wee bit of background. A special committee of members of the Scottish Parliament, or MSPs, that is the devolved assembly that I'm talking about, by the way, is holding an inquiry into the government's, that is the devolved assembly, handling of complaints against the Scottish National Party leader and former First Minister Alex Salmond, who was charged, and I have to say then acquitted, with 14 offences, namely 2 counts of attempted rape, 9 of sexual assault, 2 of indecent assault and 1 of breach of the peace, and then successfully took the devolved assembly to court and won £500,000 in damages. Now, Salmond's old friend, Nicola Sturgeon, who is now the leader of the Scottish National Party government and is right in the centre of the new scandal. Who knew what? Was it a stitch-up to evict Salmond to the political wilderness? Is it true that civil service issued instructions to staff not to work alone with Salmond? Were the accusers briefed to bring the case against Salmond to try to destroy him? All these questions, it's hoped, will be answered from the inquiry. But hang on a minute, what is hampering the inquiry? Well, the devolved assembly under the Scottish National Party government is withholding papers that could be of use to the inquiry, and the ones that have been produced are so heavily redacted they're little use anyway. Furthermore, Miss Evans, Scotland's top civil servant, is refusing to answer crucial questions, and apparently seems to be taking the lead from the SNP chairman, who seems to be dictating which questions can and cannot be asked. A wee bit of a stitch-up if you ask me. However, there's more. Enter stage right, Mr Salmond himself. And according to the Daily Record, Mr Salmond has threatened to take the Scottish Government to court unless they do release said documents. So it may be that he will win another £500,000. Who knows? But it would appear that an unnamed person has blocked some of the paper's release by a legal injunction. I mean, it just gets better, and all the time, especially as it turns out that, allegedly, and according to the Daily Mail's Paul Hutchison, Salmond himself may be the man that's blocking certain papers. whilst at the same time demanding the release of others. I mean, you couldn't make it up. And what's that lovely saying? Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. And if you're confused, well, don't worry. The rest of us in Scotland are as well. And maybe, just maybe, that might be what some are trying to achieve. Confuse, disown, divert, blame, and get through this crucial inquiry which could bring to light the seedier side of the Scottish Government without too much criticism. I've heard some say, shame on you, BBC, for not reporting on this issue, whilst at the same time giving a daily slot for an hour to the leader of the Scottish National Party government to use as a party political broadcast to further their independence ideals. But in the end, that is just what some people are saying. I personally couldn't possibly comment. Turning away from this trial, Mike Russell, Scotland's Constitution Secretary, was quoted in the Independent newspaper as saying there's absolutely no trust left in Scotland's relationship with the United Kingdom. Well, he would say that as a Scottish nationalist and one whose sole job is to make Scotland independent. He has, according to Laura Webster of The National, spoken to the future relationship with the European Union Committee, and he is quoted as saying, "The UK government's cooperation with Scotland got significantly worse after Boris Johnson became Prime Minister." Well, as it happens, there is an internal UK-wide market bill going through the House of Commons at the moment, and Russell, along with his leader Miss Sturgeon, described the internal market bill, which sees no restrictions on any part of the UK trading with any other part of the UK, as a power grab, which they believe will cripple devolution after the UK leaves the EU. It's difficult to see how that could be, but it looks like the bill will succeed anyway, and that will only add fuel to the independence debate fire. Watch this space for future developments. And just before I finish off this Scottish political section regarding independence, nationalism and the Brexit debate, I had to smile when I saw the famous Scottish actor Ewan McGregor change his mind on the independence debate. He voted to remain in the UK at the 2014 independence referendum that saw a vast majority of Scots against the breakup of the United Kingdom. I saw an interesting tweet from the majority Scots Mark Devlin, who says he is getting sick of people using Brexit as an excuse to break up the UK. Sorry for the quality, but I've recorded a short video clip from his Twitter account at @TheMajorityScot, which I'm going to let you listen to now. Stand by, Ewan McGregor and all expat Scot film stars.
I'm getting pretty sick of people using Brexit as an excuse to break up the UK. The latest in a long line is Ewan McGregor, who, live from his LA mansion and 34-car collection, called a US chat show to show how in touch he is with the people of Scotland. McGregor joins an elite club of absentee nationalists. Sean Connery, who loves Scotland so much he lives in Marbella in the Bahamas. Alan Cumming, who chants freedom all the way from New York. And Brian Cox, who has lived in Hollywood since 1995. Others can dissect the many inaccuracies in McGregor's statements, but I want to ask why he's supporting nationalism, an ugly, divisive ideology. Why is he supporting politicians who have promoted anti-English sentiment and nutters on our borders? Why is he supporting 13 years of nationalist incompetence that has destroyed Scotland's education, health and economy? Why is he supporting a nationalist hate crime law that will stifle artistic expression? And why is he supporting Scottish nationalists whose party founders hated English so much they plotted with the Nazis during the war? Look it up, Americans. McGregor doesn't live here. He's unaware of the unnecessary division and conflict we see every day. He won't suffer from a disastrous separation, but the people who actually do live here in Scotland can't escape the consequences of his loose talk. It's our taxes that will be raised, it's our services that will be cut, our mortgages, pensions, earnings and freedoms will be devalued. And that's before we get on to the stupidity of using Brexit to break up the UK. If you're for equality, internationalism and solidarity, how can you possibly support nationalism, which is against all these things? You can't claim to be international and want to split the UK and make foreigners out of our fellow citizens. You can't claim to be for social justice when separation will hurt the poorest among us. You can't claim to support democracy when your reaction to 2 referendums is to throw your toys out the pram. Nationalism is the most immature, selfish and reckless ideology on the planet. So perhaps it's no surprise it's attractive to actors like McGregor and his pals. But they're not the plucky heroes they think they are. They're actually the bad guys.
Well, tell it as it is, Mark. That was the majority Scots Mark Devlin and his personal opinions, of course. But I have to say, just to give some balance, Mark, there may be some that would disagree with your sentiments. And if Ewan McGregor or Sean Connery or any of the actors mentioned in Mark Devlin's video statement want the right to reply, then please get in touch. I'd be delighted to have you on my Unique Scotland podcast. Well, leaving politics behind, I mentioned last month that our Queen was holidaying in Scotland at her Highland retreat Balmoral. Well, she and Prince Philip have cut their Scottish holiday short to take a 2-week break at Sandringham before resuming her duties in London in October. Sandringham has been the private home of 4 generations of British monarchs since 1862 and is regularly used by members of the royal family. It can be found in the county of Norfolk, about 3 hours north of London. Sandringham Estate is nestled in 60 acres or 24 hectares of formal gardens and is open to visitors, when the Queen is not in residence, obviously. She would not want us peasants to be wandering around the grounds when she is out for her daily walk. It is said that the Queen hopes to resume selected audiences, and that is when people visit her to the likes of you and I, and also some engagements in October that will be the first time since the coronavirus struck in the UK in March. I've just been rewatching the series on The Crown, and it's great to see the young Queen played brilliantly by Claire Foy and her husband Philip played superbly by Matt Smith. Churchill's character is played by John Lithgow, and he is so believable in this character that you feel the great man staring out at you from the screen. Of course, our real Queen is now 94 years old, and Prince Philip is 99. No spring chickens, but one has to take one's hat off to them and how they still unselfishly serve this country well. Well done, ma'am, and keep enjoying my podcasts. I now want to turn for a moment to the Scottish economy, and it would appear to be crazy that in the middle of a pandemic, with quite incredible sums being spent to keep society going, and in Scotland alone the UK government has invested £15 billion, there's an absurdity to find that food bank usage in Scotland has more than doubled since the pandemic. It's up about 108%, and while at the same time house prices have increased by about 1.5% in the last 3 months alone. According to Ben Ray, Source Direct, poverty and prosperity have always stood side by side, but there's something unique about the way in which asset markets appear to become detached from the reality in this pandemic crisis. And he quotes the former Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis, who recently stated, "Something extraordinary is happening. Something that's never happened before in the history of capitalism. In Britain, the news came out that the economy had suffered its greatest slump, more than 22% down during the first 7 months of 2020. Remarkably, on the same day, the London Stock Exchange, the FTSE 100 index, rose by more than 2%. Now, Ben Ray believes that this is reflecting what's happening in Scotland's property market. As work relationships change from office workers, whereby many can now work from home permanently, there's a storm of activity in the middle to upper end of the property market as people adapt their life around that new reality. For places like the Highlands and Islands, which has been one of the worst hit parts of Scotland economically in this crisis, the effect is to increase the number of remote workers moving to the Highlands, either as their main property or as a second home, pushing up prices and making it increasingly unaffordable for locals to stay. And of course, that's on top of those speculators who buy a property in the Highlands just because land is a safe investment. Well, Ray argues that none of this is sustainable, either socially or financially. You can't have islands on the west coast of Scotland full of remote workers. The pandemic should have taught us that every place needs nurses, social care workers, etc. to function. Now, I can see Ray's point, but the only problem is getting people to move to the most remote and sometimes inhospitable places in Scotland and settle there to bring up families and become part of a community that's so different from the cosmopolitan lowlands of Scotland, regardless of the fact that it's so rewarding in terms of quality of life. So Ben Ray does have a point, but as always there has to be a balance between those who invest in the area and bring money to it and those that wish to live there. And I hope that balance is found, particularly at this extremely difficult time. Closer to my hometown of Helensburgh and around the corner from the Clyde estuary that I can see from my window is Loch Long, the sea loch that goes all the way up to Arrochar and during the war was used to practice torpedo firing from a range not far from the village. Indeed, a small loch just off the loch is called the Holy Loch, and that is where the Americans used to base their boomers or Polaris-firing nuclear submarines until the base was shut in 1992. Its closure was due to the demise of the Soviet Union when the Cold War ended and peace broke out all across Europe, with Eastern European states scrambling to escape the clutches of their Russian masters and join the EU. Can't imagine why. Looking at the regime in Russia today, it might have been prudent to wait a few years to make such a drastic decision to close altogether. What's that saying? A leopard doesn't change its spots. Anyway, the reason for telling you about Loch Long is a good news story of a semi-closed fish farming system to be introduced that will eliminate the need for chemical treatments or even the physical removal of lice from salmon, providing a more healthy, sustainable fish in the process. And exactly what is new about the system? Well, in the words of Christopher Harwood, a director of Loch Long Seafood, the farms will be adapted to capture and remove most of the salmon's organic waste, which in conventional aquaculture settings settles on the seabed. Our system will capture the waste, pump it ashore and concentrate it into a valuable fertilizer resource. Well, effectively what Chris Harwood is saying is that his company is going to capture the salmon's poo and recycle it. Forgive me for being so naive, but I had this image of little poo sacks tied to the tails of salmon, and somehow the sacks were emptied on a regular basis, perhaps with divers involved. Interesting title of a job, Salmon Poo Bag Emptying Operative. Well, it looks like in reality the organic waste, or the poo, will be allowed to drop into some sort of capture device and be pumped out on a regular basis. Brilliant idea. But just hold on a minute. How long have those poor salmon been floating around in their own poo? By my calculation, with the first marine fish farm established at Loch Aelot in Inverness-shire, opening in 1965, it's been over 50 years since they've been subjected to this appalling way of life. I mean, can you imagine if we humans were told to live in our organic waste? Well, actually, come to think of it, in the 17th century Edinburgh we did. But I digress. It's just unthinkable. And if we were made to live in our organic waste, until only recently, for example, when flushing toilets were discovered, there would surely be a public inquiry to find out what had gone wrong and what had been covered up for so long. So I wish to declare, I wish it to be known publicly, that I am now campaigning for a salmon public inquiry. So what do we know? What are the facts? Well, we know that the innocent salmon has run around in his own poo for many years and allowed to do so without criticism by equals or superiors. The inquiry would be led by a very superior fish, and I'm going to choose the sturgeon. Now, we know that the sturgeon, and I'm quoting from Wikipedia, is very suited to this task as they're long-lived, they're late maturing, with distinctive characteristics similar to those of a shark. Most sturgeons are anadromous bottom feeders, so this mighty fish will uniquely understand the nature of the salmon's problem in liberally dispersing its poo. Other species could be called upon to testify for the salmon, but the sturgeon, being a proud fish and not wishing to implicate itself, could use its shark-like characteristics to redact inappropriate testimony. Good heavens, as I record this, I'm actually starting to feel sorry for the salmon who, under the watchful eye of the sturgeon, has little chance of winning this particular battle of wills. Anyway, it was just a thought. Now, as I record this, a news flash has just popped up on my screen, and it's about Loch Long, which is what's caught my eye. Apparently, there's a massive air-sea rescue going on at this very minute. A sea tender with 4 people on board has capsized, and the HM Coast Guard are attending. Actually, a Royal Navy lifeboat is also at the scene, and I have just seen an air-sea rescue helicopter flying over the house towards the loch, so clearly that's what it was all about. So I'm glad I caught that just as I was looking at the screen. And finally, last month I told you about the island on Loch Lomond called Inchconnecan. You may remember it's called Wallaby Island because redneck wallabies were introduced into the island by Lady Cahoon in the 1870s and still roam wild. The owners, the Cahoons, put the island up for sale in July with a price tag of £500,000 with a likely sale price of £1 million. Well, Elise Wiles Brand, who was trying to save the island she lived on as a child, stepped in. She made it her mission to save it from being privatised and therefore inaccessible to the general public. The 28-year-old architect lived on the island between 1995 and 1998, when her father was a warden, and she's keen for others to have the same amazing experience that she had as a child. Her dream is to open up this exquisite escape to the local community through an ecotourism hub. What she would not wish to see is the island sold off to a private buyer who would build a second home and use it only occasionally during the year, and then close the entire island off to anyone else at any time. Well, to realise her dream of buying the island and converting it to an ecotourism hub with an open access to all, she tries to raise the $1 million expected for the sale price. Well, my last check of her crowdfunding page, she had raised close to £2,000. Not quite enough, Elise, to secure the island's future. However, the good news is that the closing date, which was the 11th, has still remained open, because having checked, yes, the island is still for sale. So, if Elise waits a little longer, and if you'd like to help Elise, please do, she still may be able to realise a dream as the price starts to tumble. I'm sure you listeners join me in wishing Elise continuing success and very well in her venture. Well, just before I go to the closing credits, and I'm recording this a couple of hours later, I've just seen on the teletype that 4 people were indeed rescued from the water in Loch Long, and after a quick visit to the Gourock Hospital, they've all now been discharged fit and well. So good news at the end of the day, and very well done to our search and rescue teams. Well, that's it for this month's Letter from Scotland, and if you've enjoyed it, then share the love and let your friends and contacts know about it. You will find all my podcasts on exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk, or find them on the normal channels such as Spotify, Google, TuneIn, Apple, etc. under the name Unique Scotland. Can I say I thank you all for your comments, and especially to you, Amanda, who listens to my podcasts from Ontario, Canada, whilst walking her whippets. I do hope you get back to the fabulous island of Islay one day, as you so wish. And I also hope that anyone hoping to come to Scotland in the near future can realise their dream. I do hope you've enjoyed this month's Letter from Scotland as much as I've enjoyed bringing it to you. Any comments on the stories or any requests for updates on anything else that's happening in Scotland, please drop me a line. I wish you and your loved ones continuing health and happiness, and during these very strange times, stay safe. I now raise a glass to you all with the traditional Scottish toast, Slanjava.
You've been listening to the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. To receive all our episodes automatically, please subscribe now.